Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That? A psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with experimental psychologist Thuy-vy Nguyen to discuss her research on the topic of solitude. Thuy-vy earned her PhD in social psychology at the University of Rochester. She is an associate professor at Durham University, Wolfson Research Institute for Health and Wellbeing Fellow, and principal investigator of the Solitude Lab. Her research has been featured in various popular media outlets, such as The Independent, NPR News, Eon Magazine, The New York Times, NPR, Business Insider, and Today.com. She is also the co-author of Solitude, The Science and Power of Being Alone, along with Netta Weinstein and Heather Hansen. My first takeaway from my discussion with Thuy-vy was that spending time alone has some major upsides. Solitude seems to be similar to the idea of discomfort and stress, in that if we voluntarily seek it out and remain receptive to the potential benefits, we can transform the activity from being something aversive to being something valuable. I was also intrigued at how the benefits of solitude can be so diverse. While Thuy-vy seems to favor leveraging solitude for low arousal activities like enjoying her coffee and reading, I actually prefer the high arousal, growth-focused side of solitude associated with traveling. Navigating a new city by myself or going on a solo nature hike are highly enriching activities for me, and they are both activities I would have avoided at a younger age. If you shudder at the idea of spending time by yourself, listen closely to Thuy-vy's pitch on the benefits of solitude. You may just unlock a new way of recharging from your busy life. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Thuy-vy Nguyen. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Hi.
So we are going to be talking about your specific research niche in solitude. And we're also going to be talking about the book that you are the co-author of called Solitude, The Science and Power of Being Alone. Very excited to talk to you about this topic. And I think, we're gonna be talking about some differences in types of solitude. We're gonna be talking about benefits of solitude. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of what solitude means to human beings, could you give an overview on the history of solitude and sort of what cultures how cultures commonly view solitude as it exists in the human experience?
Yeah, no, thank you. And yes, it's kind of nice to start off with that question as well, because I actually was just writing about that for a chapter of working on today. Uh, there is so I get there is a book that also called The History of Solitude that's very interesting that I would recommend. Basically, solitude is the way that is portrayed throughout human histories. There's seem to be two main themes. One is it portrayed a lot in like various across different religious traditions around the world. So you find that in not just Christianity, but also Buddhism, Hinduism, um, and it's so when we actually one of the um, background story when we worked on the book is that we really try to capture how solitude is written about across different culture. And one of our challenges was to actually find um, like English text talking about solitude in other
Interesting.
cultures. But you can find also there's Western, historians, philosophers writing about solitude in Hinduism, Buddhism usually is associated with practice of meditation. In Christianity, is usually associated with in the context of prayers and how it requires solitude and that's silence to really connect to God. And then the other theme in how solitude is usually portrayed in human history is how it is usually associated with different forms of punishment. So, like either, you know, practice of banishment or exile is usually used on criminal or sometimes political dissidents. And then besides that, also in like so there in the book we talk about the use of solitary confinement in the Pennsylvania prison system in
Right.
the United States. So that was in the 18th and 19th century. And then in the 20th century, is solitude is often very commonly used in mental institutions. So in the practice of like seclusion rooms, believed so usually they would just use that as a way to control patients' behaviors if they disruptive or dangerous or violent. So so the two themes kind of portrayed how in our history solitude is somewhat either something that you use to seek wisdom, or is something that is feared because it's a form of punishment or a kind of very harsh treatments for the mentally ill. So you can see that it's a bit of the two extremes there. Yeah.
Right. You start to realize very quickly that there is a difference between the different types of solitude. Uh, I think most importantly, we need to understand the difference between solitude and things like isolation and loneliness. So, could you talk a little bit about how you see those different ideas?
Yeah. So what I just talked about, those examples, it's clear that when it's used in the past, when it's used as a religious practice, that is more something voluntary, something
Right.
chosen. Whereas when it's used as a form of punishment or in mental institution, then it's more imposed and forced onto people. So the way that solitude is studied in psychology is actually it's just a very it's treated as more of a neutral state of just being disengaged from social interaction and social demands.
Mhm.
Whereas concepts like loneliness and isolation, researchers, at least researchers in solitude, actually encourage people to conceptually distinguish between solitude and those two concepts. So loneliness is usually studied more as a emotional or cognitive states, usually signaled by the mismatch between how you wish your social connections to be and the reality of your social experience. And then social isolation, on the other hand, is studied more as an objective state of when you get cut off from either a wider social network, or just cut off from people in general. So the reason I mentioned that loneliness is usually studied as more subjective states is because loneliness can be experienced in the context of solitude, but also in the context of unfulfilling social interaction. So you can feel lonely when you're around people that you don't feel that you can connect it to. Whereas isolation is usually studied in the lab where it's actually an objective experience of just stay in a room for usually up to 4 or 10 hours. So 4 hours for younger people, 10 hours for a somewhat older age group. Yeah.
In terms of loneliness, because you actually talk about loneliness quite a bit in the book,
Mhm.
even though the book mostly centers around solitude. And as I was reading it, I started thinking, because it is subjective, that feeling of loneliness, uh, it made me wonder, is the solution for loneliness being around more people, or is it more about the mindset of being of having a more objective view of your relationships and having higher self-esteem. I was trying to decide, what would be the recommendation for someone who's lonely, being around people or changing their mindset.
Um, I'd say so in terms of when you talk about trying to solve loneliness by being around other people, I think it really depends on the kind of company that you choose to be around. Because as I mentioned before, there is a risk that, when you put yourself out there, you might find that even in social context, you don't feel like you are fulfilled in that environment. Um, and it's also that in the loneliness literature, it has been shown that when someone is chronically lonely, it they actually become more hypervigilant to social threats, and they interpret their social environment as a little more threatful and also a little more negative. So because of that, that also kind of feed into how much of it that you're able to gain that present experience of being around others, or you allowed all these, you know, uh, you know, pain that you carry within you to affect your perceptions of other people. Um, and so in the book, we talk quite a bit about the motivation for being alone and how, when we need to start with, and the book, we try to at least use that as a starting point to start changing the norms around solitude, changing the conversation around solitude, and hope to kind of shift the mindset around this experience of being alone, because we have shown that there's a correlation between a more positive attitude toward solitude and people experience within it. But then when it comes to changing mindsets, it's quite a challenging task. And I have to be honest that even try to do that in the lab, not most of a lot of time it might not be successful.
Hmm.
Or sometime if we get people to think solitude as positive thing, um, we don't know how much of the positive outcome that come out of it might come from also is an issues of demand characteristics as well. So yeah. So when people just assume that, you know, oh, perhaps the experimenter want me to think solitude positively, so now I'm going to experience as positive. Yeah. So that's one of the limitation in changing mindset.
Yeah, I want to spend some time talking about the benefits of solitude. Before we get into that, there are still some important distinctions I feel that we need to make for someone that doesn't research solitude. You mentioned one of the big ones, which is that if you're choosing to be in solitude versus being forced, that's where you start getting the negative outcomes. I found one of the other interesting differences is private versus public solitude. So, if you're walking on a busy public street, you're surrounded by people, but, is that considered solitude? It made me think about, we're living in the earbud era where everyone is walking around listening to earbuds, and whether they're listening to music or in my case, it's always podcasts. Um, and I was thinking that I really enjoy solitude. I like just sort of walking in public, whether there are people there or not. But at the same time, I also feel like it would be much more difficult if I didn't have my earbuds. Because sometimes I think that, listening to podcasts, listening to music, it directly translates to not feeling alone. Like I have a voice in my head, so I'm not really alone. So if I were to be experiencing some loneliness, this makes it go away. Could you talk a little bit about that distinction between private solitude and public solitude?
Yeah, so basically, so first let's start with private and public, because I think earlier you also talk about like voluntary, involuntary solitude. So with private and public, actually this really depends on people. There are participants who actually would say solitude to them is only something that they can experience in private space. But we do see some people also, like you said, is that describe even in public space, what required is the disengagement from other social activities around you.
Interesting.
Is so you pose an interesting question around the idea of podcast, and because that's the voice of other people. So is that considered solitude? I think it really depends on whether or not you listening to something and it kind of it elicits the feeling that there's a back and forth expectation of who whatever that is that you listen to. So it's more so the disengagement is more about disengagement from the immediate need to respond to a social interaction, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah. So so it is the case that there are people who live in places like London or New York City where they're very used to the environment of having a lot of people around, and they're able to find that space to disengage because people do that. You can see that in the metro or the subway where people can just put their headphone on and disengage. And so yeah. So I think public solitude is quite an interesting form of solitude and difficult to study as well, because then we start talking about when when is it that we can categorize something as disengagement and engagement.
And
Uh,
right, because it's there's so much internal stuff going on where when I walk down the street listening to something, I might be complete, my attentional window might be inside my head listening to the earbuds, where as someone else who could be completely different, where their attention is split between, is someone looking at me? What's going on over there? Maybe they even have a hard time listening to what's going on in earbuds. I can see there being a lot of variation there. Um, I also like that you talked about eating alone, because that eating alone, you talk about that in the book. It's fun thing for me to discuss because I have a long history of going out to eating alone. I in grad school I would go out to even sit down restaurants and eat by myself, and what I thought was a completely typical or normal thing to do, when I started telling people, you get crazy looks. What do you mean? You're eating alone? To the point where even when I was on a graduate school, I was at a conference with someone, and my colleague was trying to make plans with me to meet for lunch. And I said, I'm probably not going to make it. So why don't I meet you after lunch? And she said, what do you expect me to eat by myself? And I'm like, "Well, yeah." And her reply was, Ryan, I've never eaten by myself. This is a 6-year-old human being never eaten alone by themselves. And again, that I started to realize that there's a ton of variation in the norms or expectations around eating alone, and to extend the conversation, could you talk a little bit about eating alone or even doing other activities alone and how that might vary from person to person?
yeah, it varies from person to person, and usually, well, if we talk about just the activity level, it's usually people are more okay doing alone activities that are more practical and carry some sort of utility purpose. So eating can also fit into that, but eating is kind of controversial just because depending on the culture, but most cultures still associate eating with like social activities. You eat with other people. It's a very shared experience. But whereas there's something that more commonly acceptable to be activities that to do alone is like go grocery shopping or doing chores. It's very practical. It serves a specific purpose. So with eating alone, like you said, it really depends on the context. So there are norms of it depends on so one thing is when I talk about this topic, it's almost kind of like I try to advocate for a restaurant to have those bar,
Yeah.
those bars that you can like ramen bar or just sitting at the bar to eat your food. So that is normatively pretty acceptable for you to eat alone when you sit at that space. So it's very strange when you go to a restaurant and it is clearly a sitting down family restaurant and you are there by yourself. Then now, the qualitative research that have covered this topic suggests that actually a lot of time, perhaps it's also the judgment from other people, but it's also the person kind of almost internalize that feeling of judgment that, oh, maybe other people think that I'm being weird. So that's when the individual difference would come in. If you are someone who pretty okay with that experience, you maybe would perceive that less kind of in, you have that internalized, I don't know, you call that shame maybe, experience less. Whereas someone who, like your colleagues who's have never tried that before, might feel a little bit self-conscious. And this also, the literature talk a little bit about there's some kind of gender norm as well with associate with, you know, women being out in public space, usually eating or traveling by themselves, and usually there's more of a gender norm around that space. Yeah.
Mhm. So if you said that the idea is it's a challenge to convince people that solitude is a good thing, why don't we jump right into the benefits? Because you detail a lot of, these independent views, these independent motives, uh, and benefits associated with solitude. So could you just give an overview of some of those, please?
Yeah, so when it comes to why people would actively pursue solitude, um, we identify, so that's the concept that we call self-determined solitude or autonomous solitude, chosen solitude. And um, people usually approach solitude for, purpose of rest is one of the big theme. So it's actually there was a survey conducted by the BBC that when they asked people what activities you do for rest and solitude, I think considering that they surveyed more than 18,000 people around the world, it's more than 50% of those people actually elected solitude to be one of the top three. Now, so solitude is good for rest. It's also something that people often associate with time for self-reflection and self-discovery. And also, actually, one of the focus of my work is looking at solitude in the context of emotion regulation and stress regulation because people do prefer to be alone more when they have those negative stressful experience. So that kind of help us also understand that, sometimes the motivation around solitude, toward solitude, doesn't have to be just about avoiding other people. Sometimes you just have some those benefits that you really want to gain when you're by yourself. And those key benefits that I have mentioned is rest and relaxation, emotion regulation, and then self-reflection. One final thing is talk about also people want to pursue solitude for freedom, for autonomy, just because when you're around other people, there's always a little bit of negotiation, like talking about eating, even when you want to agree for a place to eat or when to eat, it's a little bit of negotiation with, oh, what's the other person's schedule, what their preference. But when you're by yourself, a lot of people talk about how they don't have to compromise. They
Mhm.
have more freedom to just choose whatever they want to do during that time. Yeah.
Do you think that people who do more, um, or who are modifying their public self more would benefit more from rest? So I was just thinking, if you're the type of individual who's high in authenticity, you're basically you with for no other way of putting it, you are yourself, whether you're in public or private. It
Mm.
seems as though you would need less solitude to recoup. But if you're the type of person who is doing a ton of regulating, perhaps maybe it's somebody with ADHD or autism or something like that, where you're out in public and you are constantly modifying how your urges are being expressed, what you say, how you come off to other people. It seems as though you might benefit from more solitude. Would you agree with that?
So, that's a very interesting question because it tapped into some of the new data that we have collected. So this is a data set from younger people, because we found that the desire for solitude when you have those negative experience, either social or just generally feeling negative emotion, um, is more salient for younger people. So younger people do talk about using solitude time as a way to regulate and process negative experience, perhaps also because they don't want to feel exposed when they have those negative experience. And then we follow up with a data set with young people between 16 and 20. And we found that it's like what you said, is that people who generally the kind of personality that usually associate with social difficulty, or just someone who when they in social context they just have to spend a little more energy to navigate the context. So even introverts, so introverts because with extroverts they're more familiar with how they interact with other people perhaps, but with introverts it required a little more. So we see introverts and then people who, what you described there in the study, we look at this idea of people who tend to engage in social masking. So that's when you went around other people, you feel like you have to mask certain thing or either, be a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Then they are the one who tend to prefer solitude more likely when they have those negative experience. And I
Mm-hmm.
do see that suggests to us that, people who have to exert more energy to navigate social environment, they would need more solitude when those experience might feel a little overwhelmed or
Mm-hmm.
overwhelming to them. Yeah.
Now, are there specific cognitive functions that you think require solitude? So I was thinking about, a developing human being. If you take a teen, a young adult, you put them in a tribal setting. Uh, on the surface, that sounds great. They're going to learn a lot about socializing and navigating norms and working as a group and cohesion. Um, on the surface, that sounds great. Um, but if you take that to the extreme where you're never alone and
Mm-hmm.
you don't have any solitude, one would think that maybe there's something that is not developing, like that there is something that you need, or there are certain skills that might require solitude. What are your thoughts on that?
So when it comes to, you mentioned cognitive capability or cognitive function, I don't think we have an answer to that question yet. In terms of developmental, you know, from a developmental perspective, there's this idea that the capacity for solitude is something that can be built early on when you're a younger person. We don't know how early we need to intervene, but the idea is that, at least from my perspective, it's more about building habits. So like what you said, if someone who just grow up in an environment where they constantly be around other people and never get the opportunities to develop a healthy habit. Healthy habit meaning, you know, habits, activities that they do, for example, that they are,
Or even making decisions for yourself. Like if you're interconnected, if you're too interconnected, you never really have to make individual decisions on your own time. So
yeah,
you might that muscle may never develop.
yeah, yeah, no, no, that's definitely like I actually used also muscle, like building your solitude muscle. Is that it's a way to kind of getting familiar yourself with solitude so that, when you in that space, you don't feel almost, oh, what am I gonna do now? But the thing is, I have to mention this is that we don't know though, is that some children they do have, and you can see that from a very early age, that they do have just this general preference to do things on their own. In the developmental literature, so Robert Copeland, he's one of the researchers that kind of talk about this idea of unsociable children. So they're not the one who previously thought to be as shy or anxious, because they're not shy or anxious. They just generally want to do things on their own. They don't try to like hide from other children. They don't try to push other people away. That's just you do see that on the playground that some children do reply, and we don't know that there might be like something about these children that kind of just gently shape their propensity for solitude. And I wonder also that individual difference also kind of like somehow contribute to those children discover the activities that they like to do alone. And because of that, they have more opportunity to kind of shape that habit. But it's always the nature and nurture aspect is that
Mhm.
parenting practices might also interact with that because some parents might see their child wanting to play alone as a sign of something, um, there's something wrong with my child. Or the teacher might see that and flag the parents. Or some parents might just allow their children to just do that. And there are other time and other space where children need to develop their social skills and stuff like that, but also kind of accept that space. And I know that like there's practices like quiet time for children to read or things like that. Yeah, I do think that is there's some unique, maybe cognitive ability which we don't know that might also shape the propensities, and also because of that allow some children to develop a habit for solitude more, but at the same time the environment, social norms, parenting practices that can also feed into that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I talk to people and I get the impression that they find solitude very aversive. And my mind would always go back to like, is this something, is this aversion to solitude something that can be avoided through those early developmental stages? I sometimes get the impression that people are uncomfortable just sitting in silence with their thoughts, and they so quickly go to coping mechanisms like television or calling friends, or even being with people uh, romantically, that maybe they have this sort of enmeshed relationship where they never have to be alone.
Mhm.
So I was thinking about what are some key developmental scenarios where this might happen.
Yeah. One, I definitely would love to kind of test that in younger children at some point. Because I think one standing hypothesis is because now, people start talking about neurodivergent. And that can be one of the key thing that we can look at. Um, and yeah, because because when you mentioned earlier about people who never really get the opportunity growing up to just have their own space, I was one of those kids because I grew up in a huge family, like talking about 30 cousins.
Hmm.
And, it's always family, family, family. And we didn't really have like, we shared room and we always share space. But I'm still that kind of kids that just, take the bike and then take a map and just went out and explore things on my
Hmm.
own. A lot of time I think about that. It's like, what is it that got me to just kind of prefer that? And there's time where there's family gathering and I still join people, but I always come late because I need to go explore something else.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's very interesting.
So we've talked about people that are averse to solitude, but I'm also curious if someone can be too comfortable in solitude. So these are individuals that may, have too much time to themselves. They don't have enough time in social environments. It's got to be hard to define what what too much solitude looks like. Um, you might think that it's just an internal desire that should tell you, I'm alone, I need to go spend time with people. But we know that internal states can be sometimes unreliable. I think of hunger, for instance. We might think like, oh, you don't have to do too much thinking about eating because your body tells you when you're hungry. But
Yeah,
that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes you have cravings that
yeah.
have nothing to do with hunger. So there's this idea that we can't necessarily rely on our internal states. So how would you say is the best approach to understanding if you were having too much time in isolation in your life?
This is very interesting because I think that there are people out there who spend the entire day alone, many day alone. I have interviewed people who live alone, and particularly when so you're talking about the experience of living alone, get very comfortable to that, and because of that, don't want to compromise that either. People can build a very strong identity around their solo lifestyle. Um, and I don't necessarily see that as a sign of concern, just because nowadays there's opportunities that people can go out. Social snacking is one of the things, is that you go to public space with the chance of conversing with strangers, go to a cafe with the chance of listening to a conversation, for example. But there is a risk that when you become, the word comfortable is tricky because uh, it's cross between when you become too comfortable with solitude to when you actually find the idea of having someone around quite aversive. Then just because they're gonna get in my face, they're gonna get into my space, I don't like that. So then that can, we start moving toward the space of, social withdrawal or social isolation. Um, what's that what's that word in Japan? This concept of someone who just stay inside, usually referring to young men staying indoor all the time playing video game.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there's a, I do think that I do agree that it's not always that we are in tune with our internal space to know that this is a time that I need to go outside. In that sense, I do think that when a person no longer see the need to go out to interact with the social world, there's something in there that could be dysregulated. So usually, I think and more consistently, the literature connect the concept I mentioned earlier. I think it's called hikikomori. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's usually correlate more with negative psychopathic pathological things. So there's some history there that got someone into that state. And I do think that the the fact that someone no longer feel the need to go out and to socialize with others is more of a dysregulated response. So we need to, as much as I study solitude and study the benefits of solitude, I do think that we still need to recognize that we are social being, um, and we do need other people. So it's quite tricky when someone just continues to stay in withdrawal and isolation and actually doesn't want to go out there. Um, that could be a sign of dysregulated response. Yeah.
That's helpful. So let's go back and talk about some the benefits a little bit more. You spend a significant portion of the book talking about specifically the benefits of being in nature by
Mm.
yourself,
Yeah.
which I really enjoyed. It's a nice deep dive into a topic that I don't really see a ton of detail in terms of articles and the literature, but there's a lot of detail, lots of interesting nuts and bolts that look at the benefits of being in nature. Could you talk a little bit about what we know about being in nature by yourself?
So nature is quite a compatible space for solitude. It's just because, we know that solitude is help us to downregulate our emotion, help us feel calmer. And nature also, independently of solitude, has been shown to have this restorative effects. So because of that, I think it just the two is just kind of like match, a match made in heaven, basically. So when there's the study that um, I think they asked people whether or not they prefer to be alone or with others after being shown different, either an urban space or nature space. And usually for nature space, people are more likely to say that they would be feel more restorative when they're by themselves. Now, one thing is that is in nature spaces also depends on the nature space. There are nature space that could be seen as safe. So, in um, national parks or things that are well tended, then people feel more restorative there. In nature space where it can be sign of danger, um, path that might be a little difficult. So that's when solitude might be less restful and less
Mhm.
calm, just because, there's safety concerns.
Right. You
So
want to be in a group theoretically if you're exploring, but there's potential danger, right?
yeah, so it's really depends on also the nature space that we're talking about.
Yeah. See, I hear you say that, and I totally think that walking alone is very different than walking with a friend or a partner in nature. My gut tells me it's an attentional thing that if you have someone else with you, your attention is divided between taking in information from the environment and then attending to needs of another person. It reminds me. I know that there's a clear overlap with mindfulness literature, but in my course, I have an assignment where students are supposed to go out and take a 20-minute walk in nature and note some things, note what their senses are telling them. And I usually encourage them to do it without somebody or even without their dog, because a lot of them ask if they can take their pet with them. And to me, it seems as though a large chunk of the benefit is the freedom of attention. What are your thoughts on the the nuts and bolts piece? What is it about that experience in nature that what are the levers that impact our well-being?
Yeah, so in artificial space, our sensory experience can be a little more overwhelmed compared to when we are in nature space. So yeah, and I'm not sure if because I don't study nature in and of itself, but there's something that I've read around. nature's soundscapes compared to artificial soundscape. And nature soundscape is actually a little less taxing to our sensory experience. So I think because of that, then when you are alone in nature, compared to when you are with someone else in nature, the Nate it's just having another person around that still occupies your sensory space a little more. Whereas when you're alone, you're able to experience all your surroundings a little more. It can be soundscape, it can be the scenery or things like that. And I think maybe that's why it's a very popular practice that people would travel. Actually, what's interesting is that there are groups that travel into nature and the wilderness. So they don't have to know each other. They are strangers. So they walk together, and that kind of solve the issues around safety. But usually the rule is that you don't talk or
Hmm.
you don't try to interact. So to me, that's still helpful as well. But yeah, so I do think the attention, and because when you're around people that you know, you kind of still have to pay attention to them and the conversation. Whereas when you're on your own, you're able to experience nature in its fullest.
For someone that is still on the fence, who's still afraid of embracing solitude and some of the benefits, uh, what would you say to somebody to help them ease in and improve their ability to tolerate or enjoy even solitude?
So yeah, so I already mentioned the challenging part earlier is that how to reframe it. It's very hard to reframe. Most people actually, I interviewed one woman one time, and she actually straight out just say, solitude is basically just another word for loneliness, but for posh people. So, so I do sympathize with, the idea that solitude can be very uncomfortable. Because even myself, I study it, I study the benefit of it, but there are times where there's some days where solitude just a little more difficult than others. So recognize that. I think there's challenges. Um, but I think one way is to allow yourself to kind of build up that muscle that we talked about earlier. So for someone who's still on the fence, one thing I would say is to try try it in smaller dose rather than try to push yourself into it. Like, we're talking about the practice of people who, whenever they make a New Year resolution of going to the gym, they just go in and they go hard. So don't do that. So with solitude, try a little bit if you're someone who unfamiliar with it. We can talk about like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, just a break during your work day. Yeah, so I saw a very interesting TikTok trend of people now going to their car to have their lunch. I don't know if you've seen, but
I have heard about this.
yeah, so well, the fact that they do film that, I think that can be a little interfere with your solitude a little. But I do think that give yourself just some brief moment of time alone during your day. And then for me, usually take a little walk around the building where I work. So try just a little bit and kind of test it out. And during that time, maybe you can discover some of the thing that you enjoy doing during that time. Maybe you're not okay with just being completely with your thoughts. Then you can bring a book. You can bring a little thing to, people like to keep their hands occupied with something.
Mhm.
So, do something by yourself and kind of develop that healthy habit for solitude, I would say. Yeah.
So my final question is, what are some of your favorite examples of solo activities to do for personal growth? Because as I was reading this, I thought about how much really enjoyed traveling by myself, which is I would, not to toot my own horn, but that's tends to be an advanced version of solitude, especially going to another country. So in 2016, I visited Japan, completely solo for 10 days, and I I immediately upon my return ranked it as something that all people should do. That traveling by yourself just feels very it feels like you're growing. You literally feel like you're growing because you have to do so much thinking. You have to navigate environments. You also are at the same time mixing in exploration, so it's very rewarding. So having been a part of a book on solitude, what would you say are some of your favorite activities that give you the most bang for your buck to do alone?
So travel is tricky because then travel is also one of the activities that, wow, is very empowering when you can do that alone. It actually very nerve-wracking for people just because it's usually considered something that you do with friends and family. For me, I actually it's very simple for me because I mean, I don't have a like busy family with children, but I do have four animals.
Mhm.
So the moment when I wake up early in the morning and just kind of enjoy a cup of coffee by myself before everyone kind of get up and being hyperactive, and that that kind of 15 to 30 minutes of sitting there with my cup of coffee is very important for me. If I don't get that, I get irritated. So that's one thing for me. And then I think it's so unfortunate that as academics, we don't have much time for recreational readings. But when I do get to do that, that is amazing. Yeah, and then to me, that's just those two activities. Um, there was an activities that I kind of developed a liking for during the lockdowns was building miniature homes. So
Oh,
that's
that's
another
interesting.
that I would pitch is that similar to what you mentioned about traveling is that building a miniature home is just there's a lot of well most of the time you have to make sure you're not gonna glue your hands to the table but it's a quite a pretty challenging and attention demanding activities so because of that I just feel like it's perfect for solitude because it just kind of like and every day you kind of just make progress so that's another thing something I do think that to pick activities when you are by yourself, competence is one of the things that, like something that you feel like you can make progress, that you can challenge yourself, whatever it is that the threshold of challenge for you is that something that get you to just make another progress the next day or the next moment. Yeah.
Again, the name of the book is Solitude: The Science and Power of Being Alone. Thank you so much for being on today, Thuy-vy Nguyen.
Yeah, thank you.
For more on Thuy-vy, visit her lab website at solitude-lab.com or pick up a copy of Solitude: The Science and Power of Being Alone wherever books are sold. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with two of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/why do we do that podcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That Podcast or X at WDWDT Pod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?